Good morning, everyone. Glad you could join me and my fellow scholars here today for a Brookings Institution panel on compromise, which is, for reasons that you're about to hear, the single most important mechanism in our constitutional order. My name is Jonathan Rauch. I am a senior fellow in the governance studies program at Brookings. You're here under the auspices of our Center for Effective Public Management. Um, and we're here live for an hour and 15 minutes, which will begin with some panel presentations and some conversation. And then we hope to bring you into the mix. So prepare your questions. If you want to send a live question, the way to do that is by email to events@brookings.edu. That's events@brookings.edu. I'll repeat that a little bit later. We have two extraordinary experts today with us. We are very fortunate to have them. One will be our main presenter. His name is David Barker. He is a professor of government at American University, a non-resident senior fellow here at Brookings, and arguably most important or relevant for today's purposes, the co-author of an important new book from Oxford University Press called Dealmakers, The Psychology of Legislative Compromise, which he wrote with Andy Ballard and Chris Carman, recently published. It's a book with some pretty important conclusions, a little bit possibly disturbing in some ways. Conversing about him with that is my colleague here in the Governance Studies program, Sarah Binder, who is also a professor of political science at the George Washington University, and one of the country's leading experts on Congress and on compromise. I'm going to just, for about 5 or 10 minutes, put a frame around our conversation by telling you a few things about compromise. The first is that we tend to think of compromise as moral compromise or something that you have to do reluctantly, a bad thing, but the world forces you to do it. That's not how the framers thought about it. Specifically, the architect of our Constitution, James Madison, saw compromise as a dynamic stabilizer. What does that mean? The founders understood that every previous democracy had failed. It failed either to populism or it failed to faction. That is, one interest group got in control and then they went to war with each other. Somehow, a democracy has to be open to constant change and adaptation, new ideas, new parties, new interest groups. And yet at the same time, it has to be stable while it adapts. How do you do that? An extremely difficult problem that no one had solved. Our Constitution says we do this by what are often called checks and balances, but are really requirements to compromise. It's almost impossible for any one branch of government or level of government, or even within Congress, to get anything done without negotiation and compromise. Well, that seems clumsy. Why would you do it? The answer is compromise is not just splitting the difference between two sides down the middle, with apologies to King Solomon. It is a dynamic, creative enterprise in which people get together to think about solutions to their problems. And if you think about compromise situations, take two little kids. One wants to play chess, another wants to play cards. Maybe they invent a new game. Maybe they go out and find other kids and say, what do you want to play? This is a creative process. And what we know about compromise, especially in legislatures, is that it very often produces solutions that are better than anything anyone walked in the door with, because they force the people in the room to go out and find fresh ideas and fresh parties to the conversation to re-energize it. That's how you get stability and dynamism at the same time. That's Madison's genius. So when compromise doesn't work, nothing else works. Congress breaks down. And when Congress breaks down, the country breaks down because there's no other forum to do the social work of compromise, negotiation, and brokering on a national level. Okay, so what do we mean by compromise? It turns out that what you and I mean and what the public means maybe not necessarily the same thing. I'm going to show you a few charts and graphs here. At least I'm going to try to, about compromise. This is all from recent survey data. And the first one shows a pretty typical result, which is two things. First, members of both parties say they like compromise. Compromise is popular, but Republicans don't like it quite as much. And what you see here, next slide, on the lower right, is that Democrats like compromise about 10 percentage points more than Republicans, though both like it a lot. Other polls, depending how you ask the question, you get quite different results. The next one, next slide. Here's a poll, for instance, this is from Public Agenda in May. 65% of Democrats, 62% of Republicans agree that politicians need to compromise. When you just ask it that way, should politicians compromise, people tend to say yes. Much closer, but in this case, as in indeed every case that I'm familiar with, more Democrats than Republicans say they like compromise. But next, depends how you ask the question. This is Gallup in 2025. And here you see a 20-point gap in how the two parties view compromise. And Republicans are actually unfavorable to it. That's unusual. Why would that be? I think it may be because of the way the question was framed next, which is that the alternative posed to compromise is even if little gets done. And I suspect what's happening here is that in this formulation, Republicans are significantly more comfortable with little getting done than Democrats are. But here's the thing. What the public means by compromise isn't necessarily what you and I might think. Next slide. This is from Pew in October. What you find is that in both parties, Republicans and Democrats say that it's important for the other party's politicians to compromise with my party. 78 and 71% say that, but fewer than half in either coalition. 46% of Democrats, 30% of Republicans place the same level of importance on their own party's elected official compromising with the other side. In other words, next, as Mo Ellethy of Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service has said, voters seem to be saying, of course I want you to find common ground. And as soon as you come over to where I'm standing, we'll be on common ground. Most Americans agree that compromise should be the goal, as long as their beliefs aren't the ones being compromised. So pretty tricky situation here if you're thinking about constitutional governance. Next, 3 takeaways. First, most Americans in both parties say that they like compromise. But second, Democrats consistently like compromise more than Republicans do. And third, both like compromise significantly less if they think they have to give up something to get it. So that's groundwork for David Barker, who I would like to bring in now, who's going to give us about 15 minutes of a presentation, including some audio-visual extravaganza. Wish us luck with that. And explain what's going on here.
Thanks, John. And thanks to Brookings for hosting this event. Most importantly, thanks to all of you who are tuned in online for letting me talk about this new book. Finally, I want to thank my co-authors, Andy and Chris, whom John referenced. As they would surely attest, I'm definitely the Ringo of our little band. So they hope that you won't hold them too responsible for any of the nonsensical things that I'm likely to say. Okay, so the starting point for this book can be found in the timeless wisdom of these ersatz democratic philosophers. Their sage observations that you can now see on the screen are especially befitting of American democracy and the way it makes policy in particular, because, as John mentioned, our institutions were conscientiously designed by the framers to compel compromise, which we define as mutual bargaining concessions in service of a mutually beneficial agreement. So importantly, right, compromise means giving something up. John just showed us that most people are happy to get compromise if it means that the other side is the side that's giving something up, but they don't want to give something up. Both parts of this definition are important, right? You have to give something up, but the idea is that you're mutually getting something. Unfortunately, as we all know, in Washington, compromise is often a dirty word. As illustrated here, zero-sum thinking frequently prevails over positive-sum thinking. And if anything, it feels like that's becoming truer by the week. The result of all that, as we've already heard, is legislative stalemate or gridlock. Increasingly over time, fewer and fewer bills of real significance are getting passed through Congress that address the major meaningful issues of our day. This slide is borrowed and updated from Sarah, actually, our other panelist here. Still, and importantly, some stuff does get done in every Congress. If you look to the right-hand side there, I've highlighted it as it relates to more recent Congresses. Some bills do make it across the finish line, and a lot of them are bipartisan. So this implies or reveals that there are still some members of Congress who will readily cross the aisle instead of just crossing their arms. So what differentiates them? What makes the deal makers want to make deals? And for that matter, what makes those who refuse to compromise inclined to stand pat? We argue that you can't really understand why lawmakers do much of anything without understanding their constituents. Members of Congress want to get reelected, first and foremost. So they usually try to do what their voters want. And given the partisan composition of how most legislative districts are drawn nowadays, coupled with just the general increasing tendency of people to move to neighborhoods around other like-minded people, that means that the particular constituents or voters that most lawmakers are needing to satisfy are primary voters. And when it comes to support for compromise, it seems that there is indeed some partisan asymmetry to what those primary voters want. As John discussed, 2 decades of surveys have consistently shown that Democratic voters, big D Democratic voters, tend to support compromise more readily than Republicans do, which may filter up to Capitol Hill through the outcomes of political primaries. However, there are reasons to question some of those earlier findings. The first one, John mentioned. Surveys don't typically ask respondents to consider their own representatives and whether their own representatives should compromise, instead asking about, their level of support for compromise in some abstract sense, which may, suffer from social desirability bias. Secondly, very few surveys, almost none, ask respondents about their attitudes towards compromise as it pertains to specific policy issues. Instead, they, again, just tend to ask people whether they support compromise in some abstract way. Should politicians in Washington work together to get along or something like that? In doing so, they tend to inspire responses that overstate the public's level of support for compromise. Therefore, our measure, which we used in 6 years of survey data, 2 of which are highlighted in the book, asks the question this way: should the politicians in Washington who share your beliefs make compromises with the other side? Or should they stand firm no matter what? There are 5 response options ranging from strongly support to strongly supporting compromise versus strongly opposing it. We also apply this to salient issues, right? So first we ask respondents how they feel about it in general, but then we ask it repeatedly how they feel about it as it relates to taxes, abortion, education, immigration, gun control, crime, the environment, foreign policy, healthcare, in no particular order. And as you can see, when you do that, the typical level of support for compromise falls a little bit, especially as it relates to the most controversial issues. However, what remains, what's consistent with those previous 2 decades of research is the partisan asymmetry. In fact, it's greater. So we see that Republicans in particular are much less likely than anyone else, not just Democrats, or actually they're much more likely to oppose compromise, to take the absolute most staunch anti-view of it. And then if you look at the more right-handed side of those bars, we see that Democrats and independents are considerably more likely than Republicans to support it. And this is the index that we created and then rescaled to 0 to 1. So why? Previous ideas in the literature about why Democrats may be generally more supportive of compromise than Republicans suggest that, well, maybe it's just because Democrats are weaker than Republicans are on average in terms of their general standing in society, or morally in terms of the degree to which they are morally principled or convicted. More flattering views of Democrats suggest that, well, maybe it's because Democrats are more open-minded than Republicans on average. Or maybe it's because they're more sophisticated. Or maybe it's because they're more diverse. Or maybe it's because they're less angry on average. Our data finds some support for each one of those explanations. However, we think there's a lot more to the story. And we suggest that bargaining at the end of the day comes down to differences in bridging mindsets versus battling mindsets. In other words, we suggest that empathy, differences in empathy, are the key to deal making. To be more precise, we suggest that compromise comes from an instinctive tendency to take the perspectives of other people who are different than you, and from values like egalitarianism that those empathetic instincts engender, which are the values, by the way, that just so happen to structure at least some types of ideological liberalism, according to more than 4 decades of political psychology research. Meanwhile, we argue that the refusal to compromise is less about moral conviction than it is about moral and personal competitiveness. It's less about having power and therefore bargaining leverage than about having a need to overpower. Much like the dogs with martinis we saw a few minutes ago, positive sum outcomes are simply not very satisfying to hyper-competitive people. And as my former PhD student, Ryan DeTamble, who's now a professor at Oklahoma State, has shown, such hyper-competitive instincts are strong undercurrents of some, not all, but some types of ideological conservatism, especially the MAGA variety, and thus with contemporary Republican partisanship. So why and how does empathy lead to compromise, and competitiveness lead to its opposition? We offer 6 pathways through which we think this plays out. I'm going to talk quickly about 4 of them. First, most straightforwardly, we argue that empathy, and this is almost necessarily true, that empathy promotes positive sum thinking rather than zero-sum thinking. Secondly, empathy tempers the interpartisan hostility that is so prominent on Capitol Hill and in the country, which gets in the way of people working together. Third, as I alluded to a minute ago, empathy fosters some types, at least, of liberal or progressive ideology. And liberals and progressives, as John mentioned earlier, are just more interested in making policy, right? So it heightens policymaking ambition. Liberals and progressives want the government to do things. They want the government to address problems legislatively. In general, on average, conservative Republicans are less committed to that. They're less interested in that because they tend to believe that when the government does things, it screws things up, right? So if you're less interested in the government doing things, you're going to be less interested in making deals. Liberals want government to do more, conservatives want government to do less. And so because empathy inspires liberalism, it leads to compromise. Finally, the values that undergird that liberal or progressive ideology, namely egalitarianism and humanitarianism, are generally thought of as altruistic. And those type of altruistic moral convictions then reverse the otherwise obstinacy inducing role of moral conviction. I said a minute ago, right, that a lot of past research shows that, well, part of the reason why some people don't want to compromise is because they have strong moral convictions, right? And so if you have these intense moral convictions, then compromising feels like selling your soul, right? And so you don't want to do it. But what we find is that that's not true if the specific values to which you are about which you are convicted are these liberal ones. Okay, a little bit of the evidence. So I just want to show you a smidgen of it. The first is a controlled experiment where we asked people, we asked one randomized group of respondents, in your mind, imagine somebody very different than you who's trying to defeat you in a competition. The treatment group just got a benign statement. Here are the results. We see, first of all, that those who received that treatment, encouraging them to think about somebody trying to defeat them, in general, tended to be less supportive of compromise than did people in the control group. However, what we really see, if we look at those dark bars, is the people who we otherwise had measured as more competitive were triggered by that statement. And as a result, it seems that they were especially disinclined to compromise. Here's a second experiment, which is explicitly about primary candidates. The first group saw this statement. It's about a candidate, right, who's running for Congress, right, and competing in that respondent's primary. I don't want to play Washington games. I want to serve you, and that means negotiating some compromises with our opponents on important issues. The challenges our country faces are too big for us to foolishly dig in or hold out. When we do that, we all lose. So a pro-compromise statement. The second group saw this one, an anti-compromise statement, right? So it's similar in some ways. I don't want to play Washington games. I want to serve you. But then it says that means standing firm against pressures to compromise on important issues. The challenges our country faces are too big for us to give in or sell out. When we do that, we lose. Okay? So here are the results. We see that more egalitarian respondents who saw the pro-compromise statement, right? We're evaluating the pro-compromise candidate as indicated by the dotted line, tended to be much more supportive of that candidate than if they saw a different condition. Meanwhile, the ones who saw the anti-compromise candidate were less supportive. And the reverse is true, right? So the least egalitarian respondents in our sample, as you can see over here on the left, tended to quite like the anti-compromise candidate, and they hated the pro-compromise candidate, right? Okay. Finally, we move away from studying voters to studying actual members of Congress. And we did so looking at those members from 1995 through 2020. And we tried to measure differences in their levels of empathy. We did so through looking at their tweets. We analyzed over 4 million of their tweets and encoded those tweets for their differing propensities toward empathy. And then we tried to measure their propensities toward compromise. And we did so in two different ways, just one of which I'm gonna talk a little bit more about here or show you the results from. And that was the degree to which they were willing to or tended to insert text in new legislation that had previously been included in legislation by the other party, right? So we think that if members, when they're writing new legislation, if they insert bill text that originally came from the other side, then that reflects some sort of process through which some kind of a deal was struck to include that text and therefore those interests or those designs on that legislation. Okay, so we see first that if you look here at the bottom, the effective Democratic Party ID, right? So and this dotted line over here on the left is a zero effect. That would reflect like no differences between Democrats and Republicans, right? And so we see that the effect of Democratic Party ID from being more empathetic, right? Those who are more empathetic, either in terms of their personality or their values, are more likely to be Democrats. Okay. Next, we similarly see that Democrats, as we expected, were more likely than Republicans to reveal what we think is compromised behavior through the insertion of this bipartisan bill text, right? And then most importantly, we see here that regardless of party, that the lawmakers whose tweets indicate that at least publicly, at least in terms of what they reveal to the public, they have greater empathy or significantly more likely than to engage in that compromised behavior, or what we are arguing is that compromised behavior. Okay, so in conclusion, voter empathy enhances legislative productivity and broad policy representativeness and stability. Such empathy is waning in society, however, on both sides of the aisle. That's a point that I want to emphasize. What we observe, the partisan asymmetries that we observe, are not the byproduct of Democrats like increasing their degrees of empathy in society. Quite the opposite. Democratic empathy is diminishing. It's just that Republican empathy in the MAGA era is diminishing even further. So if we want Congress to pass more meaningful legislation on contentious issues, we should try to foster some more of that empathy among voters and among legislators. All right, thanks.
Thank you, David. Sarah, let's bring you in for perspectives you have on these findings.
Excellent. Great. Thank you both, and especially to David for the very... So I am going to say just a little bit upfront, praise for the book, what's unique about it, and why I think it matters. And then develop a little more, some reactions or observations about the book and the arguments and evidence. So first, the praise. Like every good feedback sandwich, start with the praise. This is a bold, I think, and ambitious book. And I say that for a few reasons. First, people can disagree about this, but I would say there's very little untilled ground in the study of Congress. It is a pretty mature, robust subfield. Not to say there aren't new questions, but it can be hard to find new ground. And this book does exactly that, right? There is a lot of work on political psychology within the discipline of political science and within the broad subfield of American politics. There's lots of psychology within the discipline of economics, of course, behavioral economics, a whole sort of subfield in itself. But most of this work is about, at least from political scientists, it's about mass politics, not so much about elite politics. Mass political behavior, obviously here, about public opinion. But for the study of Congress and legislative decision-making, we don't often open the door to political psychology. There are exceptions, as you point out. Adam Ramey and co-authors' book about the big 5 personality traits amongst lawmakers comes to mind. But more often in American politics, and specifically the study of Congress, we don't open the door to political psychology. We draw from economics a lot. Sometimes we draw from sociology, but psychology much less often. And so I think the first big contribution here is opening that door and looking for those connections, both with respect to building a theory here about, quote unquote, about compromise, and then empirically, both, as you do in the book, both observational and experimental evidence. So first, contribution is opening the door. Second, I think when you open the door, we find a very fertile, untilled field. And David, as I said, has given us a very excellent summary of what he and Andy and Chris Carmen have found. And so I don't want to go through the findings again. I just want to highlight what strikes me as the key contribution here. And that's the connections drawn, right? The kind of the through line from individual psychological dispositions to electoral considerations of those voters to lawmakers' legislative choices. And so David and Andy and Chris here are, I think, quite ambitious in the connections that they draw, but they're also very empirically careful. You are very honest about the strengths, but also the limits of these data and the analyses and the limits of the inferences that we can and should draw. So overall, I think the book is substantively important and analytically quite careful. And I think we get the sense from both John's opening as well as David's summary of the book. It's a project that will appeal to political scientists, but also, I think, importantly, to observers and participants in American politics, and certainly watchers on Capitol Hill. Okay. So far, so good. I have a couple of observations. I have about 3, generally. And I raise them as things we might want to come back to in discussion, but they are my reactions as a student of Congress who is not well-versed in psychological approaches. So the first thing I want us to think about is the difference between deal makers and deal making. And your book is what we would call a kind of a micro level analysis of a Congress, right? Individual level unit of analysis, we say, right? We're studying individual lawmakers, obviously with an important eye to like macro consequences, right? Deal making. But I would say it's not a book about deal making. As the title says, it's about the deal makers. And that's important for all the reasons we've been talking about. But I'm not so sure the two are the same, deal makers and deal making. So why not? I guess 2 reasons first, right? Decisions necessary to reach agreement on policy questions are arguably more than the sum of lawmakers' psychological dispositions. Institutions, rules, norms, electoral incentives, party leaders, ideas, right? All of these are in the mix. And they arguably make a difference in whether lawmakers and leaders go to the bargaining table in the first place, right? Let alone whether deals are made and what they look like. And obviously, I'm preaching to the choir here, David. Right, you help run a project at AU on negotiation, right, reaching agreement in politics. So none of this is news. But I do think it's important to distinguish between what we can learn from the deal makers versus deal making. So the other point to think about this distinction here is that it's possible that deal making isn't strictly about compromise, as our friend Jenny Mansbridge often, I think, and importantly reminds us, right? Because legislative deals are often win-win, right? They're not often or as often zero sum, right? Lawmakers don't typically, right, divide the pie, they enlarge it, right? Win-win. You want peach pie, I want pumpkin pie, right? We don't bake up, we don't compromise with a peachkin pie, right? We bake 2 different pies. And again, I know you are obviously well aware of this, but I point this out solely because I think we have a ways to go to get from the deal makers, right? This great ambitious book progress you've already made, but then a ways to go to get to learning more about deal making. My second general observation is that I'd like us to think a little bit about the implications of your argument for the dynamics of congressional change, right? Taking your psychological approach, we could come up with at least 2 ways for Congress over time to change. Replacement versus, right, conversion, as we say, right? Replacement. Either we get more empathetic or more competitive or a mix of both types of candidates for office, which then in turn, once elected, shifts the psychological profile of Congress. And oftentimes this type of argument about replacement assumes there's some sort of exogenous shock to the political system. Here, I think it's helpful maybe to think about the rise of political violence. Is it going to shape who's willing to serve in Congress, right? The risk that a wrong, quote unquote, wrong vote will subject you to the wrath of activists or threats to you and your family. We can think about the impact of new presidents, Trump and Republicans in particular, right? A pugilistic president, is he more likely to attract those competitive types to run and to win? And of course, Democratic Party is changing too, right? Younger activists want leaders who play hardball. Perhaps not necessarily to break the system for the sake of breaking the system, but to get the government to be more responsive and more accountable to a broader diversity of interests. So it's possible we could yet see change in the mix of psychological profiles of lawmakers in future Congresses, which might then, as from your arguments, have a different impact on their legislative behavior. Conversion's quite different. I don't know that we see a lot of it, right? People come to Congress and change the way they operate. We have anecdotes. I don't think we have a lot of evidence of it, but Patrick McHenry, our favorite, or my favorite, comes in as a young Turk, Republican bomb thrower. He leaves as like this institutionalist, everybody's favorite temporary speaker, or maybe it was the bow ties. I don't know. But even he drops out of party leadership well into his service so that he can concentrate on his committee work and the Financial Services Committee in a more productive way. Now, again, that may be the exception that proves the rule, but I wonder whether there's more opportunity for that type of conversion we might see. Marjorie Taylor Greene, she said she regretted her contributions to toxic politics. She's gone from Congress. We won't be able to see how that experiment plays out. But more generally, I'm kind of curious, is this mix of lawmakers inevitable, subject to change, and what and when might drive that change? Or the connections between psychological dispositions and, as you argue, party affiliation, so strong that change only comes from changing party balance in the House and or the Senate. Okay. That's observation 1 and 2. Third, I want just a couple more things on the partisan asymmetry. And I guess I'd raise 2 points about this. I think the controversial, or at least eye-opening finding in the book is the empirical finding of these psychological differences on average between Democrats and Republicans, right? It's a bit of an uncomfortable finding, even if there's empirical robustness to it. Now, in some ways, it's perhaps not controversial at all, right? The notion that those high on empathy might value collective responsibility over personal responsibility, and those high on competitive values might favor personal responsibility over collective responsibility, and that roughly comports with some of the ways we distinguish between at least the ideologies of Democrats and the values, Democrats versus Republicans. But I do think we might need to kick the tires a bit more on that distinction. I wonder, one question, is this different than what political scientist Sean Thierout called partisan warriors when he studied the advent of what he called the Gingrich senators? A different, is this just a different style of politics shaped by electoral and ideological interests? And of course, as you point out later in the book, there is a lot of variation at the individual level in degrees of empathy, although, as you say, more variation amongst the Democrats than you find amongst the Republicans. But I do want to know more about how far and how hard we can lean on these psychological predispositions to explain legislative outcomes. And second, on this partisan asymmetry, I'll just end here on a little minor wonky note here about causality, and you tackle this briefly in the book. I'm not entirely convinced that causal arrow goes from one's psychological predisposition to party identification. And it's certainly plausible that these psychological, perspective taking or competitiveness, that might encourage you to run in one party or the other, or to identify with one party or the other, We think of it as these sort of not ideological sorting into parties, but psychological sorting into the parties, You find the partisan home that fits your psychological disposition and your values best. Is it possible the causal arrow goes in the other direction, that one's partisanship shapes what looks like one's psychological disposition, After all, At one point, you measure legislators' psychological profiles with their tweets, which, as you recognize, are a bit performative. But perhaps your party in Congress creates incentives to be more or less confrontational and competitive. And so if those behavioral tendencies are one part personality trait and one part legislative strategy, then they might actually be shaped by your party label and party leaders, right? Whose job it is to manage the party brand once you get to Washington. So I just wonder about our appropriate level of confidence in this underlying question of causality in terms of which way the arrow's going. But to finish the feedback sandwich, it's a great book. It's different. You are tilling new ground. You're tapping a critical question about whether and when Congress can solve problems, right? Understanding, of course, that the parties can disagree about whether or not something is a problem or not. But I will stop right there.
Thank you, Sarah, for those very incisive and detailed thoughts. David, if this were an academic meeting, now would be the time for you to offer your many thoughts and reflections in answer to Sarah. I'm going to suggest, if it's okay with you, that we actually not do that and that we fold your responses into the subsequent conversation, because we'll also have many other questions. Got a bunch already, actually, that are very good from viewers. Can you live with that? Or if not, is there something you want to say in 1 minute that strikes you as especially important right now?
No, that's fine with me. I just want to say thank you for the sandwich. I haven't eaten yet today, and unfortunately, in those kind of sandwiches or those feedback sandwiches, the meat tends to be the more critical stuff. But I'm enjoying the bread and the meat. So thanks again, Sarah, and I'm sure we'll discuss some of those things more.
I'm told that feedback sandwiches are out with HR because everybody knows what's coming.
What was especially helpful about those comments is emphasizing that this research, apart from its own findings, it opens the door to an interesting line of inquiry, and one that is, in my view, a little bit disturbing. I'm just going to take 5 minutes as a participating moderator to explain what I mean by that. And how it may explain some odd things that we've seen recently. One example, for example, is that we recently saw the longest ever government shutdown. And if you came up in Washington in the 80s, as I did, when you had a lot of compromise and a lot of committee work and a lot of floor debate and a lot of what we called regular order, that almost certainly could not have happened. The dynamic of that process was the Republicans said, we want a clean bill with no changes, and we're the majority, and we get to do that. The Democrats said, hang on a minute, we account for almost 50% of the votes in Congress, and thus we're entitled to ask for some stuff in exchange for our votes. We want some compromise, actually not very much. The Republicans' answer to that was not the sort of traditional Madisonian, okay, let's sit down and hammer this out. What do you want? It was no. Flat no. Shut down the government. That's your fault because we're entitled to do this without compromising at all. That is a strange dynamic. And if you think about the billions and billions of dollars it costs to shut down our government, it's not a very constructive one. So what's going on here, and why do I use the word maybe a little disturbing? Why has compromise grown harder? 3 things happened in the background. First, the parties sorted ideologically. When I grew up, there were conservative Democrats, there were progressive Republicans. That made it a lot easier to do cross-partisan deals. That changed. Now all the conservatives are in one party and all of the progressives are in the other. The second thing that happened was polarization. The disagreements between the party moved from being primarily about issues to being what's called affective, which is to say, as they sorted out, the two sides thought that they had less and less in common and began to fear and hate each other. That makes compromise harder. The third thing that happens is that the polarization becomes asymmetrical. Republicans move further to the right than Democrats move to the left. There are all kinds of measures that show this, and one of them is that Republicans and Democrats tell us this. When you ask them how conservative they are, there are a lot fewer centrists in the Republican coalition than there are in the Democratic coalition. The Democratic coalition has conservatives. Republican coalition basically has no liberals. So you get these pulling apart, you get they're hating each other. The Republicans are moving farther than the Democrats. And now we come to David Barker and his co-authors. It's not just that the parties are asymmetrical as relates to ideology. What if they're also asymmetrical psychologically? What if one type of person is more attracted to one party and the other type of person is more attracted to the other party? And what if, as Sarah says, the internal dynamics of the party are reinforcing those psychological tendencies so the causality can move in both directions? What happens if you get this psychological asymmetry? Well, here's a sentence from David et al.'s book. We emphasize that the Democratic-Republican differences in empathy and competitiveness remain large and appear to be growing. So what David Barker and his co-authors are saying is that this asymmetry in psychology is, if anything, getting even worse. And remember what Sarah tells us and what David tells us, it's against the backdrop of both parties becoming more resistant to compromise. So here's what I want to know. I'll ask both panelists if they want to say a word about this. In the real world, if this is the tendency, if these multi-level dynamics are pulling the parties apart in very different directions, what does that imply for our legislative outlook?
Well, I mean, I think it doesn't pretend well. You know, I will say that, and again, our argument is based on voters and lawmakers wanting to satisfy those voters. But a good thing is that a lot of voters, most voters, almost all voters, I might argue, don't really have that much of a sense of what their legislators are actually doing. They don't know how they vote on most bills. They don't know their stances necessarily, even on a lot of policy issues. And as folks who study negotiation more pointedly will point out, that's a good thing. Transparency, ironically, and in some cases, is actually bad for getting stuff done in Congress, right? Members of Congress need to be able to negotiate in private. They need to be able to hash this stuff out and be willing, right, to potentially strike deals and make concessions and you know, expand the pie and all that kind of stuff without necessarily worrying about voters looking over their shoulders. And when you do that, you see that the actual lawmakers themselves are oftentimes demonstrate more empathy than you might expect, given the signals that their voters are sending them and the way that they respond. Indeed, as many people have pointed out, on Capitol Hill, members of Congress behave differently toward each other in private quite often than you would think, given their public rhetoric, right? They send signals to their base on CNN and on Fox. But then they can talk behind the scenes and be much more reasonable. And so I think that there's potentially some hope. And indeed, as I pointed out on one of the slides, right, some stuff does get done, including some bipartisan stuff. And so it's not entirely dead. Back to your point about sort of the evolution of these partisan differences, though, and again, the differences in empathy and competitiveness, which we do say are growing. As I mentioned earlier, it's not because Democrats are becoming more empathetic. Quite the opposite. It's Democrats and Republicans are alike in society and on Capitol Hill are becoming less empathetic. It's just that Republicans are becoming even less empathetic than Democrats. And so in terms of what that means for deal making and for democracy, right, it's not a sanguine story. And indeed, we expect things to get worse before they get better.
And these things could, of course, reinforce. People in the Democratic side could become more competitive as they respond to Republican tactics and so forth. We could be in a spiral already. Sarah, do you have anything to add on the outlook if this kind of thinking proves to be accurate?
I would just add two things to what David said. This perception and the tendency that it seems that deal making is more difficult. I would offer these two points. First, I think that perception and the degree to reality has increased the electoral and policy importance of unified party control, right? That a single party, all eggs are in the basket of winning House, Senate, and the White House. And once they do that, they know it's not going to last very long. And so each party has basically stretched and changed the rules of the game to make sure that they can get their top policy achievement with only their party's votes, right? Through complicated budget rules that eliminate filibusters. And so there is adaptation going on here. And I think that adaptation is a recognition of the difficulty of deal making when you have to deal the other party in. Yeah, we can think about the policy consequences of having single parties write policy. But I do think that's a recognition and adaptation, what we see. And the second point is David mentioned at the end here that in my way of thinking, like lawmakers at the end of the day are still single-minded seekers of re-election. And along those lines comes this notion of not wanting to be blamed for really bad outcomes. And that does help motivate the party's leaders more often these days to go to the bargaining table to negotiate win-win deals, right? The clearest one that comes to mind, the CARES Act during the pandemic, and a whole host of pandemic-related measures. Now, maybe that's legislating in a crisis. Maybe that's a different set of conditions. But that was divided split party control, Trump in the White House, and a package that dealt in both parties to get their most preferred outcomes for better or for worse. And so those infrastructure, finally doing a deal, until this year or till last year, avoiding shutdowns. So there is still this electoral dynamic that despite these increasing, as you said, right, David, decreasing levels of empathy, even if unevenly in the parties, there are these other electoral dynamics that do kick in to try to generate deals where we might otherwise think they'd be really hard and out of reach.
David, yes.
Yeah, can I just add a quick thing again in terms of the outlook and things that we might do and whatnot. And this is also partially in response to Sarah's point, right? Because indeed, if I were to criticize my own work, the first thing that I would say is okay, well, what's the actionable point, right? What are we actually supposed to do with these findings? And leaving aside the empathy versus competitiveness stuff and the partisan asymmetry for a moment, and thinking in terms of, thinking prescriptively in terms of our institutions, focusing on the fact that voters are really the ones who we argue are driving this, then one thing that we can do is support things like districting reform, right? That would encourage state lawmakers on both sides to redraw district lines in ways that minimize partisan advantage as opposed to maximize it as they're doing right now. And there are ways to do that where neither side would be disproportionately hurt by the process. And if so, then lawmakers would be more inclined to want to appeal to the median general election voter as opposed to the median primary voter, right? And that can change their calculus.
I was going to get to institutional reforms a bit later, but since you're there, we have a very good question from a viewer. I'll just jump it to the front of the queue, which is related to this. So the biggest thing now in campaign reform world is jungle primaries, nonpartisan primaries with ranked choice voting and the equivalent of a runoff. And the idea there is that you can make it easier for people of a problem-solving, compromising mindset to get through the process, because you won't have small pools of highly ideological voters effectively controlling nominations. Do one or both of you think that that reform specifically or other changes like it in political dynamics, we already spoke about redistricting, could make a significant difference in the complexion of compromise?
I do. I don't know that they would, it's the silver bullet or anything like that, right? And we see in in some of these states that have implemented these reforms, the effects that you can attribute to those forms are not typically enormous, right? But I think that there these types of things are could move the needle, right? And could make a difference at the margins at least.
Sarah, any thoughts on that?
I think it depends on what the shape of the institutional reform is. And I'm not that well versed in those primary studies, but at least some of them, like from the California experiment, long now run experiment, even with the nonpartisan primary, if the makeup of the parties, the activists and those inclined to run are from the left and the right, the rules themselves can't generate centrist candidates because they may or may not be able to, right, to win. There is a bit more evidence in terms of redistricting reforms, in terms of the creation of commissions, whether or not, bipartisan, nonpartisan, and so forth. But they do tend, on average, to increase the competitiveness of elections run under commissions, and maybe that is one way to break up the chain of generating either people with less and less empathy or more and more.
But open primaries, closed primaries.
I think the evidence is a bit mixed, even though theoretically one would think that open primaries might generate more compromised candidates or more centrist candidates. I don't know. I don't know that the research actually is terribly comes down strongly in favor of that finding.
Yeah, one of the things about open primaries, I think I'm thinking explicitly about studies that focus on kind of semi-open primaries and the role of allowing independents into your primary, which I should also mention tend to be at the presidential level, where at least I've looked at a lot of this. You see that, well, the problem is that most independents are not, in fact, these moderate swing voters that we like to imagine in some democratically ideal way they would be, where they're carefully considering both sides, and that's the reason that they don't have a partisan attachment, and therefore, they're these thoughtful, sophisticated voters. Very few independent voters fit that profile. The vast majority of independent voters are Democratic or Republican leaners, who in fact, so they say they're independent at first, but then when you push them and say, well, do you lean more toward one of the other parties? They say yes. And it turns out that those independent leaners tend to behave just like partisans. And oftentimes the reason why they don't want to call themselves partisans is because they think that the parties are themselves too moderate. Right. And so those types of independents tend to not help things, quite frankly. And the ones who are left over, the ones who are generally in the middle, are generally in their middle because they don't actually follow politics that closely and they don't know where they stand. So
I am personally mystified by the following that open primaries have attracted, because the majority of places primaries already are open and it hasn't made any difference.
Yeah.
So we know that. We got a very good question in advance, a number of them, but this one is one I want to especially focus upon, because I think it's important to say to readers, viewers, excuse me, who haven't read the book, that the term empathy can be a little bit misleading in this context, because it sounds value laden, like kind or decent or charitable. And David and his co-authors aren't using it in that sense. They're using it to talk about something called perspective taking, which is too many syllables for our purposes, but they're using it in a more objective sense of a certain kind of negotiation tendency. And with that in mind, a question came in. I assume that the number of Republicans in Congress who are even open to bipartisan deals is minuscule. Would it be fair to say that fewer than 20% of Republicans are open to making such deals? David, I thought you might want to address that, just in case people out there think you're saying Republicans are not kind, generous, or decent.
absolutely. And I'm really grateful that you gave me the opportunity to make that distinction. First of all, I don't think it's possible for us to estimate what percentage of either Democrats and Republicans in Congress are actually open to making deals. Our data don't allow us to do that. I'd love to know. But secondly, to your point, John, and indeed, some people don't even call what we're talking about empathy, right? Some people distinguish between empathy or what you might think of as compassion or sympathy or empathic concern, right? Which is like a bleeding heart type of thing, from what we're really talking about, which is perspective taking, as you said. And that, to elaborate, is the instinctive tendency to understand the point of view of people who are different than you, right? So it's a little bit more of a cognitive process, and to just sort of see where they're coming from. And knowing where your opponent is coming from, it turns out, not only enhances the odds of getting a deal done, but it actually enhances the odds that you will get more of what you want. And this is especially true in Congress, where this is a repeat game over time, dependent upon relationships that you have with your colleagues. As Sarah mentioned earlier, I'm a co-principal investigator on a project here at AU that is a partnership with Harvard as well, called the Program on Legislative Negotiation, where we train people on Capitol Hill to be better negotiators. Their motivation for taking part in those trainings is rarely, hey, let's all come together and sing Kumbaya and strengthen democracy. No, they want to take part in those trainings because they want to be able to be more effective negotiators, i.e., get more of what they want into bills that get across the finish line. It turns out that understanding the underlying motivations of your opponent to get, i.e., understanding their perspective, helps you to be able to again expand the pie and find creative solutions that can work for everybody and move the ball forward. And I want to credit somebody who may or may not be listening right now for some of our thinking on that, who is Jenny Mansbridge at Harvard, who has contributed a great deal to research on this and has helped us tremendously.
One of the things diplomats will stress is how important it is to get inside the psychology of the other side, and that this can be trained. This can be learned. It's not about goodness or kindness or sweetness. It's about understanding where the other side's coming from so that you can negotiate and maneuver more effectively in order to get what you want. And I think that's kind of the point that you're making. We have another question that gets to a point that David touched upon briefly, which is, have rules governing Congress now so changed from the LBJ times, which make compromise more difficult? I'm going to direct that one to Sarah after taking moderator's prerogative to say yes, they have. One thing that David alluded to earlier is we decided it would be better if Congress were very transparent. So we all but got rid of voice votes. We got rid of non-public committee meetings, and members of Congress tend not to behave as well when they're in the public view because they're grandstanding. And that's made life harder. Another thing which has happened has been concentration of authority in the offices of the leaders. So the rank and file have less incentive to compromise. They don't even often have much role in legislation. But Sarah, over to you. Have there been institutional changes that have further complicated this picture?
Well, I guess I would start with the caveat that, and as you sort of suggested, the changes in the rules in the 70s, the rules aren't like exogenously given, right? The lawmakers choose rules they want to secure particular outcomes. They can't always get what they want, and some rules we know, filibuster rules, sometimes are harder to change. It's harder to build a political coalition to get those rules. So we want to be a little careful in thinking that it's the rules that are barring deal making. They can raise political barriers to deal making, but the rules themselves, I want to be a little careful to say that the rules make it harder to negotiate. But by and large, yeah, the pressures on lawmakers in both chambers right, to give more authority, to centralize more authority in party leaders' hands. Looks different in the House and Senate, but that incentive came in part because they didn't want to be in this world where you spent all day on amendments on the floor and loss of control and inability to pursue the party's agenda. And all that's happening while the parties, as John mentioned earlier, are polarizing, like ideological sorting into the parties. So, yes and no. Certainly the set of rules we have that empower the speaker, well, we're getting a good experimental watch here, right? The rules themselves are the speaker's power is only as strong as his ability to marshal majority, right? His party majority under those rules. So yes, enormous amounts of agenda setting authority, ability to defer votes, ability to decide when you're going to take the votes. That perhaps has squeezed out the minority party, but the rules themselves aren't magic here, right? Speaker Johnson has to have a workable majority, and it's not clear that he does, even with those rules that empower and centralize authority.
Rules are, of course, not magic, but they do, beyond being rules, they socialize members of Congress into certain patterns of behavior. So fewer people run now in order to get on committees and advance through those committees so that they can have their hand in an appropriations bill or a defense authorization bill. And more of them run to get on social media. And that's partly a result of these rules. If we can do this without going down a rabbit hole, Sarah, in like 30 seconds, I'll put you on the spot. Some people say the filibuster incentivizes compromise by forcing you to go to the other party for votes, and others say it disincentive compromise because it's just so damn hard to get anything done. Do you have a view on that? We're talking the Senate, obviously.
If we lived in a world with a lot of moderate lawmakers, very few liberals, very few conservatives, absolutely. The 60-vote rule, regardless of the size of the majority, the 60-vote rule, yes, would moderate outcomes because you just have to change it a little bit. And there'd be a lot of lawmakers here in that bell-shaped curve, a lot of lawmakers willing to take it, right? We don't want to spend $15 billion, but we'll shave off $12 billion. Okay, you got a deal. But when the parties are polarized on the left and on the right and somewhat factionalized often within those parties, the rule more often leads to stalemate, for better or for worse, right? I don't want to assume that the failure to legislate is bad. Sometimes one party or the other may think that's a good thing. But that high threshold in a world of shrinking majorities, small majorities in the Senate, intense majorities and minorities, opposition parties in the Senate, complicates lawmaking. And in that sense, the filibuster rule, the supermajority rule, is putting compromise often out of reach and increasingly often out of reach.
We've got about 7 minutes and two good questions. I'm going to try to get to both of them. The second's going to be about media. But the first, which came in advance, we can't avoid the T word. So let's just go there, Trump. We know that this is a person whose whole persona has been built around deal making, the art of the deal for many years. But we also know that many people would say that he has driven the Republican Party in a more extreme direction. The question that came in is, has deal making become better or worse during the Trump administration? And let's broaden that to both Trump administrations and broaden it even further, if you like, to what's the role of the president in our system in incentivizing or disincentivizing Congress, or perhaps muting or exaggerating the psychological tendencies that David's talking about. Whichever one of you wants that, grab it.
I'll start, and there's a lot to say, and there are several different dimensions to this. On the one hand, or I guess I'll start here, right? Trump is perhaps the most hyper-competitive person that we've seen in American politics in terms of his rhetoric anyway, in terms of his public persona and the stuff that he says on social media and the way he treats opponents. And that's reflected through his administration, including in the comments by folks like Stephen Miller, right, who recently essentially told someone in I think the New York Times, I could be wrong about that, but he gave a might is right speech, right? I mean, we live in the real world where strength is everything, basically, and the people who have the power get to do what they want. And so that's a view of negotiation and bargaining that is all about leverage. And I think that Trump's art of the deal point of view is one that's all about leverage. That the strong do what they want, and the weak fight for the scraps, and sometimes the strong might be willing to give the weak some scraps, but that's about it. So in that sense, right, I think that the person of Donald Trump and the Republican Party that has emerged around him is certainly one that is less interested in that empathetic, perspective-taking type of orientation that can facilitate compromise. On the other hand, part of the reason why Trump got elected in the first place in 2016, and it sounds weird to some people for me to say this, but Trump is actually less ideological, right? He's less conservative. He's less ideologically conservative than were his predecessors. He's not a constrained ideological conservative. He might, and again, I don't want to be too controversial here, but I mean, certainly some people would say that he's more authoritarian than his predecessors, but that's not the same thing as being ideologically conservative. And so because he's less ideologically conservative, certainly when it comes to the free market, that opened the door in his first term to a few deals, because Trump did want to get stuff done. He did want to make his mark. He was highly ambitious, right? He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to have a legacy. He wanted to make an impact, right? And so that opened the door to a series of bipartisan deals, most notably in terms of the COVID response, but also when it comes to criminal justice reform and some other stuff. And so overall, empirically, if you look at the patterns over time, the legislative effectiveness and bipartisan legislative effectiveness has not gone down in the Trump era.
Sarah, anything to add on that, on the Trump effect?
The only thing I would add is that if we want to figure out, and I think it's a great question about whether sort of deal-making capacity and deal-making has gone down in the Trump presidency, especially the second term, or it depends at least on two things, in addition to the things that David had mentioned. First, party control here matters, but also the president's agenda matters. Like, what's on the agenda? Because in a period of party control, we think of party leaders on Capitol Hill as carrying water for the president. And after the One Big Beautiful Bill Act law, I don't see much else at all on the president's agenda. He's got no use for the agenda for Congress. He calls himself Mr. Speaker, if the reporting suggests. He thinks by fiat he can cap interest, credit card rates, interest rate, all sorts of ways in which he thinks he can address affordability crisis and housing crisis by executive order, most of which probably won't happen. So again, if there's a big, broad demand for legislative action, it might be easier to evaluate. But I don't see much interest on the administration's part of going to Congress.
A further complication is, if you're a Democrat, you don't want to compromise if you think the compromise won't stick. And if you think you'll pass a bill and then the next thing that happens is the Office of Management and Budget then goes around the compromise, does what it wants to do anyway, that can be pretty toxic. We have 2 minutes left and one question, which I'm going to direct to David Barker, because he wrote a book called Dueling Realities with Morgan Marietta, which relates to media and what people are seeing. And the question is, does the fragmented and partisan nature of the media world and the piling on dynamic of social media, does that further complicate and exacerbate the issues that you're writing about? You have 1 minute. Good luck.
The short answer is absolutely, but they're not the root cause of it. They kind of, as you said, exacerbate or build upon the underlying tensions and psychological orientations of people, right? People are motivated reasoners. They want to believe the things that they believe, and they see reality through the lens of those tainted value orientations, right? And identity orientations. But our media environment has made that easier, right? And so none of us share any information anymore. All of us get, reinforced, right? The information that we want on a daily basis, especially through social media, where we don't even necessarily, read articles or anything. We tend to get headlines. And the people that we see from the other side on social media tend to not be representative of that other side. They tend to be straw men, right? They tend to be the worst. And so absolutely, has been a complicating factor, and we find ourselves now right in this place where, right, we may live in one nation, but we live in two completely competing realities, and that makes it hard to deliberate.
Well, our time is up. I want to thank both of you for your marvelous presentations. I want to encourage all our viewers to think more about compromise. It is the single most important, I believe, concept in keeping a liberal democracy running on the rails. And I want to urge everyone to get their hands on a copy of Barker, Ballard, and Carmen, Dealmakers, The Psychology of Legislative Compromise. Although it's political science, it is a short book. It's a readable book. There's a chunk of methodology in the middle, which you can basically skip, and it will open your eyes to a new way to think about these issues. Thank you all for being here today.
Thanks, everybody.